September 1943, one of the bloodiest periods of the Second World War, and the largest mutiny in British military history. Yes, you heard that right. The mutiny in which more soldiers were court-martialed at once than in any other incident in British military history. 191 soldiers, all of them war veterans, all of them heroes who had fought against Rommel's Afrika Korps in the scorching deserts of North Africa. Men who had shed their blood at El Alamein, at Tobruk, at Tunisia. And one day, these men refused to obey orders. Was it because they were cowards? Absolutely not. Was it because they didn't want to fight? Never. So why? Because they had been lied to, because the promise made to them had been broken, and because these brave men had become victims of military bureaucracy. This story remained classified for 50 years. Court documents stamped with a 75-year secrecy order were only released early in 1993, and that's when the world finally learned of this great injustice. If you watch this video until the end, you'll discover one of the most striking and least known stories of the Second World War. A story where heroism and betrayal, loyalty and bureaucracy, honor and injustice are all intertwined. Now hit the like button and subscribe because you won't want to miss a single detail of this story. So if you're ready, let's begin. Our story begins in the spring of 1943 in North Africa. The British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery was about to complete one of the grueling military campaigns in history. This army was made up of legendary units known as the Desert Rats. The 50th Northumbrian Division and the 51st Highland Division were among the most elite units in this army. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were the heroes who had changed the course of history at El Alamein in the dark days of 1942, when Nazi Germany's Afrika Korps was on the verge of capturing Egypt. As Winston Churchill said, "Before Alamein we never had a victory, and after Alamein we never had a defeat." Montgomery had made a promise to his soldiers, just one more operation. After capturing Sicily, they would go home, to England, to their families, and then they would prepare for the greatest military operation in history, the Normandy landings. This promise meant everything to these men. During those days when they endured the hell of desert warfare, battling malaria, dysentery, scorpions, and the deadly attacks of the Afrika Korps, this promise kept them going, to go home, to reunite with their loved ones, and then to fight one more time to liberate Europe. A promise is everything. But fate had different plans. In early September 1943, 1,500 soldiers were loaded onto ships from a transit camp in Tripoli, Libya. Most of these soldiers were veterans of the North African campaigns. Some had just recovered from wounds, others from malaria, and they had all been told the same thing: you're going to rejoin your units in Sicily. When the ships set sail, no one knew the truth. As they sailed across the blue Mediterranean, the soldiers talked among themselves. What was Sicily like? How were their comrades in their units? When would they go home? These questions echoed across the ship's deck. And then the bombshell dropped. You're not going to Sicily. You're going to Salerno, and you'll be joining the British 10th Corps attached to the 5th American Army, not the 8th Army. Can you imagine? You're being torn away from the men you fought alongside for years, shed your blood with, faced death shoulder to shoulder with, and you're being sent to a unit you don't know, under officers you've never seen? In the British Army, this was a highly unusual situation. Unlike the American Army, British regiments stretched back centuries. The bond between soldiers wasn't just military, it was also cultural, regional, and emotional. The soldiers of the Highland Division came from the mountains of Scotland. The soldiers of the Northumbrian Division came from northern England. These men weren't just soldiers, they were brothers. And now this brotherhood was being torn apart with the stroke of a pen. So what was happening at Salerno? On September 9, 1943, Allied forces had landed on the shores of Salerno in southern Italy as part of Operation Avalanche. The Fifth Army, under American General Mark Clark, was on a critical mission to capture Naples and push into the Italian interior. But things didn't go as planned. The Germans were ready. The 16th Panzer Division and other German units responded fiercely to the Allied landing. Between September 12th and 14th, the Germans launched a major counterattack with 6 motorized divisions. Their goal was clear: to throw the Allied forces back into the sea. The situation was critical. American and British units were taking heavy casualties. General Clark was in urgent need of reinforcements, and this urgent call reached the transit camps in Africa. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and like. Thank you. But here, a mistake was made. A big mistake. What was this mistake? Reinforcements were supposed to be sent from Algeria, but due to an administrative error, the order was sent to the 8th Army Transit Camp in Libya. And so 1,500 soldiers who were expecting to return to their units in Sicily found themselves on ships headed for Salerno. About 1,000 of these soldiers were new recruits, still waiting for their first assignment, but the remaining 500 were veterans of North Africa, desert rats, heroes of El Alamein. And around 300 of these 500 veterans found themselves in complete chaos when they arrived on the shores of Salerno. Organization was non-existent. No one met them, no one told them what to do. The new soldiers were immediately distributed to units, but the veterans were taken to a field and left there. For 3 days they waited in that field. For 3 days they hoped someone would notice the mistake and send them to their real units. What an enormous mistake, right? When Montgomery learned of the situation, he was furious. "If I had known what was to be done, I would have said no," he later wrote. But Montgomery wasn't there, and the soldiers were trapped in the middle of a bureaucratic nightmare. On September 20, 1943, 10 Corps Commander Lieutenant General Richard McCreary came to the field to address the soldiers. The general openly admitted that a mistake had been made, but then he gave the soldiers a choice: either join the 46th and 56th Divisions now or face the consequences. He promised that once the emergency was over, they would be returned to their own units. For the soldiers, this wasn't enough. Why? Because they had been promised before, and that promise had been broken. Because their trust in the officers in the chain of command had been shaken, and because the most fundamental value of the British soldier, regimental loyalty, was embedded in their DNA. General McCreary warned the soldiers: disobedience to orders in wartime means mutiny, and the penalty for mutiny is death. This warning sent a shockwave through the field. Of the 300 soldiers, 108 decided to comply with orders. They took their weapons and marched off to join their new units. But 192 soldiers remained. These men stayed there. They didn't move. They were unarmed. They used no violence. They simply stood there. This would become the moment when more soldiers were charged with mutiny at one time than any other in British military history. And this moment would remain classified for 50 years. Now think about it. Were these men cowards? Absolutely not. They had been through the hell of desert warfare. At El Alamein, when the tanks of the Africa Corps were bearing down on them, they hadn't budged. Did they not want to fight? Quite the opposite. But they wanted to fight with their own units, with their own comrades, under their own officers. What these men did was a matter of principle. They had been lied to, and they refused to accept that lie. What would you do in such a situation? Let me know in the comments so we can discuss it. Montgomery later wrote in a letter clearly laying out the situation. The men refused to go into battle, which is of course unforgivable. But the same Montgomery also knew that these men were never cowards. They were simply victims of a bureaucratic error. And this is where our story takes a truly dark turn. 192 soldiers were arrested. All of them were disarmed, and all of them were taken to a prisoner of war camp. The ironic thing is that by the time they were arrested, the emergency at Salerno had already ended, the German counterattack had been repulsed, and the beachhead had been secured. These men weren't even urgently needed anymore. But the army couldn't back down. It had to maintain its authority. And so, 192 war veterans were sent back to North Africa, to Algeria, to face one of the largest military court-martials in history. In late October, the trial began in the gymnasium of a French school in the city of Constantine. This would be the British military court-martial with the most defendants tried at one time. Each soldier had a number hung around his neck. Hugh Fraser was number 111. This young Scot had proudly joined the Cameron Highlanders Regiment, risen to corporal in desert warfare, and was known for his courage. And now he was being identified by a number. The trial lasted 5 days. The defense team had only had 6 days to prepare. It was an impossible task. Most of the witnesses were fighting at the front and couldn't be called, and perhaps most shockingly, not one of the 192 defendants was called to the witness stand. They weren't even given the chance to defend themselves. The result? All found guilty. 3 sergeants were sentenced to death. Corporals received 10 years, privates 7 years of hard labor. The death penalty. Can you imagine? Men who had fought against German tanks at El Alamein were now going to be killed by their own army's bullets. But the story doesn't end here. 2 weeks later, fortune smiled on these men for once. General Sir Ronald Adam, the second most senior officer in the British Army, came to North Africa, and he demanded to see the mutiny file. When Adam examined the file, he was horrified by what he saw: a series of officer errors, wrong directions, broken promises, and a trial that was far from fair. With General Adams' intervention, all sentences were suspended. The 3 sergeants were saved from the firing squad. The others were released from prison. At that moment, the right decision had been made. But this wasn't the happy ending of the story, because the real punishment was just beginning. The soldiers were, ironically, sent to the very units they had refused to join, and there they were branded as mutineers. Some were constantly sent on the most dangerous night patrols. Others were kept on the front lines even when their units were withdrawn to rest. This was an unofficial punishment, a punishment that left no paper trail, but ruined lives. About 80 soldiers, crushed under this persecution, deserted. All of them were caught, and they spent the rest of the war in solitary confinement. When they were released in 1945, they had to serve another 18 months in the army. When they got home, they learned their war medals had been taken away. Their pensions had been cut. One soldier had to return his gallantry medal, the medal he had received for the heroism he showed in the Desert War. And this entire story remained classified for 50 years. The 75-year secrecy order was lifted early in 1993. Historian Saul David was the first researcher to gain access to the court documents, and his book, Mutiny at Salerno: An Injustice Exposed, introduced this dark story to the world. In 2000, Scottish Member of Parliament Anne Begg made a call in Parliament for these men to be pardoned. She told the story of Hugh Fraser, one of her constituents, the story of an old man who had retired as a police inspector in Aberdeen but could never shake the label of mutineer. But the government refused. Armed Forces Minister John Speller said, "No matter how unjust an order may seem, disobedience to orders in wartime cannot be forgiven." And do you know what Hugh Fraser said? "I would do the same thing again, because it was a matter of principle." This is not just the story of 191 soldiers. This is the story of the deepest values of the British character, a sense of justice, a sense of belonging, and loyalty to one's principles. An American historian wrote, "If these men had been in the Soviet army or the Nazi army, they would have been shot on the beach. But in the West, in liberal democracies, the self holds great value, and these men decided that their own sense of justice was more important than military code." This was the end of Part 1, but the story doesn't end here. In Part 2, we'll dive into every detail of the Salerno Mutiny. We'll explore the hidden details of the court records, the personal stories of the soldiers, and the bureaucratic nightmare behind this tragedy. If you're curious about Part 2, subscribe right now and hit the like button, because we're just getting started. Welcome back to Part 2, everyone. Let's continue. In Part 1, we told the story of how 191 British veterans mutinied and faced the largest military court-martial in history. Now we're diving deeper into this story. If you're just starting to watch this video, make sure you watch Part 1, because to fully understand this story, you need to put all the pieces together. And if you're enjoying this series, subscribe and turn on notifications, because in Part 3, we'll discover the shocking finale of this story and the debates that continue to this day. If you're ready, let's continue. Now let's go back in time, to the summer of 1943, to North Africa. In May 1943, Allied forces captured Tunisia, and the Africa Corps surrendered. 3 years of desert warfare had come to an end, and the architects of this victory were Montgomery's 8th Army. Within this army, the 50th Northumbrian Division and the 51st Highland Division held a special place. These two divisions were among the most elite units in the British Army. The 50th Division came from northeastern England, from the region between the rivers Tyne and Tees. The division's emblem was 2-letter T's representing these two rivers. These men were the sons of miners, shipyard workers, and farmers, tough, resilient, loyal. The 51st Highland Division came from the legendary Highlands of Scotland: Cameron Highlanders, Seaforth Highlanders, Gordon Highlanders, Black Watch. The names of these regiments carried a warrior tradition stretching back centuries, fearless Scottish warriors who went into battle accompanied by the sound of bagpipes, wearing kilts. These two divisions had been fighting almost continuously since 1940. They were there during the fall of France. They were evacuated at Dunkirk. Then they were sent to North Africa. And there they fought in one of the most grueling desert campaigns in history. Let's remember El Alamein. October 1942, German General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had reached the gates of Egypt, the Suez Canal, Middle Eastern oil, perhaps even the fate of the war itself hung in the balance. Montgomery gathered his army at El Alamein, and on the night of October 23rd, with more than 1,000 guns firing, history changed. The 51st Highland Division was at the center of this assault. To the sound of bagpipes, they advanced into the German minefields. The casualties were horrific, but they didn't back down. The 50th Division fought with the same determination at Wadi Akarit, at the Mareth Line, in the mountains of Tunisia. In every battle, these men shed their blood. And now, in the summer of 1943, they had been made a promise. After the Sicily operation, they would go home. This promise meant everything to these men. They had been fighting for years. Malaria, dysentery, jaundice. Desert diseases had worn them down. Wounds had left marks both on their bodies and their souls, and they hadn't seen their families for years. Going home. These two words were the force that kept them going. In July 1943, the invasion of Sicily began. The 50th and 51st Divisions fought at the front once again, and when the operation was successfully completed, the soldiers began packing their bags. But some couldn't leave Sicily. The wounded, the sick, were sent to transit camps in North Africa to recover. The heroes of the Salerno Mutiny were these men. Transit Camp 155 in the city of Tripoli, Libya, was where these soldiers gathered. Here, there were hundreds of veterans waiting to return to their units. All of them were filled with the same hope. They would reunite with their comrades in Sicily. Then they would all return to England together. Camp Sergeant Green had clearly told the soldiers, "You will return to your own units." This was an official order, and the soldiers had trusted it. On September 14, 1943, 1,500 soldiers were called to board ships. Most of the soldiers volunteered for this call. Why? Because they thought they were returning to their units. Sicily was somewhere in Italy, and they were eager to reunite with their friends. No one told them the real destination. It was kept secret. The ships set sail into the Mediterranean, and only when they were in the middle of the sea did the bombshell drop. You're not going to Sicily. You're going to Salerno, and you'll be joining the British 10th Corps under the 5th American Army, not the 8th Army. Now, let's pause here and explain what this meant. The concept of regimental spirit in the British Army was very different from the American Army. In the American Army, soldiers could be transferred to different units as needed. This was normal practice. But in the British Army, a regiment wasn't just a military unit, it was a family. It had traditions stretching back centuries, its own marches, its own flags, its own heroes. For a Highland soldier, the Cameron Highlanders Regiment wasn't just a workplace, it was part of his identity. This was the secret of Montgomery's success. He understood this loyalty of his soldiers. He promised never to send his men to die foolishly, and the soldiers trusted him. Now these soldiers were learning that this sacred bond had been severed. Chaos broke out on the ship. The soldiers were angry, disappointed, but what could they do? They were in the middle of the sea. On September 16, 1943, the ships reached the shores of Salerno. And here, things got even worse. Salerno was a battlefield. Only a week earlier, Allied forces had landed on these shores. The German counterattack had just been repulsed. Everywhere was filled with smoke, rubble, and chaos. Please subscribe for this story. Thank you. When the soldiers came ashore, there was no one to meet them. Organization was non-existent. No officer knew what to do with these 1,500 soldiers because they were the wrong reinforcements. Instead of the soldiers who were supposed to come from Algeria, they had been sent from Libya by mistake. A bureaucratic error, but the consequences would be devastating. The new soldiers, about 1,000 of them, were quickly distributed to units. They didn't belong anywhere yet, so it didn't matter where they were sent. But the veterans were different. About 500 North African veterans were set aside and taken to a field near the beach and left there. 3 days. For 3 days and 3 nights, these men waited in that field. No one told them what would happen. No one gave an explanation. They just waited there, in uncertainty. During these 3 days, the soldiers talked among themselves. They assessed the situation, and they came to a conclusion. This was a mistake. Someone would notice the mistake and send them to their real units. That was the right thing to do, and the right thing would happen. How wrong they were. September 20th, 1943. The date of the Salerno Mutiny. That morning, the soldiers gathered for a formal parade, and Lieutenant General Richard McCreary, commander of X Corps, came to address them. McCreary was a respected commander in his own right. He had fought in North Africa, served at El Alamein, but today he would be on the wrong side of history. The general spoke frankly to the soldiers. He admitted that a mistake had been made, but now there was an emergency. The 46th and 56th Divisions had taken heavy casualties. They needed reinforcements, and these soldiers would be that reinforcement. McCreary made a promise. Once the emergency was over, everyone would return to their own unit. But for the soldiers, this promise was empty, because they had been promised before, and that promise had been broken. Then came the critical moment. An officer stepped forward and read the relevant sections of the Army Act. Disobedience to orders in wartime was considered mutiny, and the penalty for mutiny was death. The field fell silent for a moment, and then the soldiers made their decision. Of the approximately 300 soldiers, 108 decided to obey orders. Perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they were worried about their families. Perhaps they just wanted it to be over. Whatever the reason, they fell in line and marched. But 192 soldiers didn't move from where they stood. These men didn't use violence. They had no weapons anyway. They didn't shout. They didn't protest. They just stood there, silently, resolutely. This was a matter of principle. Corporal Hugh Fraser would describe that day years later. I said to the private soldiers, "Make your own decision. I know what I'm going to do, but if you want to go, go." Every man was in a position to make his own decision. They were all good men. They had all seen combat, and they knew what they wanted. Fraser also added, maybe one or two of them wanted to avoid combat, but the majority's reason for disobeying orders was the same as mine. We had been told we were returning to our units, and then we had been lied to. And at exactly this point, the most ironic detail of the story emerges. By the time the soldiers were arrested, the emergency at Salerno had already ended. Yes, you read that right. The German counterattack of September 12 to 14 had been repulsed. The 8th Army was advancing from the south and had linked up with the 5th Army on September 16. The beachhead was secure. These 192 soldiers were no longer urgently needed. But the army didn't back down. It couldn't. Because if these soldiers went unpunished, authority would be undermined, discipline would crumble, and in the middle of a war, that was unacceptable. At least, that's what the commanders thought. 192 soldiers were arrested, disarmed, and taken to a prisoner of war camp on the beach. Then they were sent back to North Africa, to the city of Constantine in Algeria, and there they were held in prison for 5 weeks. During these 5 weeks, no one spoke to them. No one helped them prepare their defense. They just waited. On October 22, 1943, the defense team assembled for the first time. Captain Hugh Quennell took on the defense, but he faced an impossible task. He had only 6 days to defend 192 defendants. 6 days. Think about it. 192 separate files, 192 separate stories, 192 separate witness lists, and only 6 days. Quennell couldn't even properly meet with the defendants. He didn't even know that many of them were sick when they were arrested. Malaria, dysentery, jaundice. Most of these men weren't even in any condition to fight, but this information never made it into the court records. October 29, 1943, the trial began. The location was the gymnasium of a French school in the city of Constantine. This was the only place that could hold 192 defendants at once. Each soldier had a number hung around his neck. Corporal Hugh Fraser was number 111. Sergeant Charlie Smith was another number. All of them were heroes reduced to mere numbers. What a painful situation, isn't it? The trial lasted 5 days. The defense team tried to call witnesses, but most of the critical witnesses were fighting at the front in Italy. They couldn't be brought in. Only one witness was heard, Camp Sergeant Green. And Green confirmed that the soldiers had been told they would return to their own units. He explained that there had been an official order from headquarters and that the soldiers had been misdirected. But it wasn't enough. And here's the most shocking detail. Not one of the 192 defendants was called to the witness stand. Not one. They weren't given the chance to mount their own defense, to tell their own stories. Was this a trial or was it a show? The result was no surprise. All were found guilty. When the sentences were read out, the gymnasium turned to ice. 3 sergeants, death penalty, death by firing squad. Corporals, 10 years hard labor. Privates, 7 years hard labor. Hugh Fraser was in shock when he received his 10-year sentence. "I couldn't believe what I was hearing," he would say years later. The next day, the 3 sergeants learned their fate: death. These men were heroes who had fought against German tanks at Alamein. Now they were going to be killed by their own army's bullets. But fate intervened at the last moment. On November 15, 1943, General Sir Ronald Adam arrived in North Africa. Adam was the Deputy Chief of the Imperial General Staff of the British Army. He was one of the most senior figures in the army, and he demanded to see the mutiny file. When Adam examined the files, he was shaken by what he saw. A series of officer errors, wrong orders, broken promises, inadequate defense, and horrifyingly severe sentences. General Adam intervened, and all sentences were suspended. The 3 sergeants were saved from the firing squad. The others were released from prison. But this wasn't the happy ending of the story. Because a suspended sentence didn't mean pardoned. These sentences could be reactivated at any time, and the soldiers would have to live with this threat. Even worse, the soldiers were ironically sent to the very units they had refused to join. Yes, you read that right. They were sent to the 46th and 56th Divisions, the very units they had refused to join because of the mutiny. And there, hell began. They had been branded as mutineers, and some officers never forgave this. Unofficial punishment began. This, too, was a heavy penalty. Some soldiers were constantly sent on the most dangerous assignments: night patrols, reconnaissance missions, the deadliest sectors. Others were kept on the front lines even when their units were withdrawn to rest. While everyone else was resting in the rear, they were waiting in the trenches. This was a torment that left no paper trail but crushed souls. The words spoken to one soldier's commander summed up the situation. "The mutineers' sentences have been commuted to continuous duty on the front line." Such a punishment didn't officially exist in British military history, but it was being applied unofficially. Hugh Fraser was seriously wounded at Anzio. He spent the rest of the war at headquarters in Naples. He was lucky. Others weren't so lucky. About 80 soldiers crushed under this persecution deserted. All of them were caught, and they spent the rest of the war in solitary confinement. When the war ended in 1945, these men were released, but they couldn't go home. They had to serve another 18 months in the army. And when they did get home, they experienced the real shock. Their war medals had been taken away. The Africa Star, the Italy Star, the 1939-1945 Star, the symbols of honor they had earned in the Desert War no longer belonged to them. Their pensions had been cut, and one soldier had to return his gallantry medal. The Military Medal was one of the most prestigious gallantry awards in the British Army, and this man had received it for the extraordinary courage he had shown in the Desert War. Now, because of a bureaucratic error, he had to give it back. These men returned to society as mutineers. Their criminal records said mutiny. Finding work became difficult. Their social lives were affected. Among them were men who couldn't look their families in the face, who lived with shame. And perhaps the most painful thing was that they couldn't tell their stories. Because all the court records carried a 75-year secrecy stamp. No one could know the truth. No one could hear their defense. In 1979 and 1980, some newspaper and radio reports in Scotland brought this story to light. The BBC wanted to prepare a documentary for its 40 Minutes program, but the program was never broadcast. The story continued to remain in darkness. Please don't forget to subscribe and like in honor of this hidden story. Until 1993. That year, before the 75-year secrecy period had expired, the court records were released early, and historian Saul David was the first researcher to gain access to these documents. What David discovered was shocking. He saw how the defense team had been obstructed, how witnesses couldn't be called, how the defendants had been silenced. He found correspondence documenting how transit camp officials had deliberately misled the soldiers. And most importantly, he uncovered evidence proving that these men weren't cowards fleeing from battle, but heroes who wanted to fight with their own units. David published his book, Mutiny at Salerno, An Injustice Exposed, in 1995, and this book broke 50 years of silence. The book included this assessment by Richard Holmes. David rightly emphasizes that this mutiny was caused not by the men not wanting to fight, but by not wanting to fight among strangers. And most of these mutineers displayed an honorable and soldierly attitude throughout the entire process. This was the end of Part 2, but the story isn't over. In Part 3, we'll discover these men's fight for a pardon, the debates in Parliament, and why this story still matters today. If you're curious about the final part, subscribe and like, and we'll get right to it. We're together again for the final part. In the first two parts, we told the story of how 191 British veterans became victims of a bureaucratic error, how they faced the largest military court-martial in history, and how their lives were ruined. Now we're opening the final act of this story, the search for justice, the parliamentary debates, and the questions that remain unanswered even 50 years later. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, pause this video and watch them first, because to feel the full weight of the finale, you need to know the complete story. If you're ready, let's begin. 1998, Aberdeen, Scotland. Anne Begg was a newly elected Scottish Member of Parliament. She represented the Aberdeen South constituency, and one day, at a constituent meeting, two elderly men she didn't know appeared before her. Bill Bradbrook and Hugh Fraser. Bradbrook had come to tell his friend Fraser's story, and Begg listened to one of the most shocking stories of her life. Hugh Fraser had been a young corporal in 1943, a Scot who had proudly joined the Cameron Highlanders Regiment and fought bravely in the Desert War. At Salerno, he had mutinied along with 191 other soldiers. He had received a 10-year prison sentence. His sentence had been suspended, but his life had been ruined. After the war, Fraser had managed to pull himself together. He had become a police inspector in Aberdeen. He had built a respectable career, but inside there was a burden he had carried for 55 years, the label of mutineer. Fraser said to Begg, "I became a police inspector. I achieved a lot, but I could never erase this black mark on my character." As Beg listened to Fraser's story, she found herself drawn back to the North Africa and Italy of 1943, and she made a decision. She would fight for these men. March 22, 2000, London, Westminster. Anne Beg had requested an adjournment debate in the House of Commons. The subject? Pardons for the Salerno mutineers. That day, Beg took the floor and addressed Parliament. What caused 191 men to make the same decision on September 20, 1943? When these men faced charges of mutiny and were told that mutiny was an offense punishable by death, why did they stay where they were? Why did so many men disobey the same order? They can't all have decided they didn't want to fight. Something must have gone wrong in the chain of command. Beg listed point by point why the soldiers should be pardoned. First, these men should not have been at Salerno. The wrong soldiers had been sent from the wrong transit camp. This was a documented bureaucratic error. Second, the soldiers had been lied to about their destination. Officers who knew before boarding the ship that they would be joining the 46th Division had not told this to the soldiers. This was deliberate deception. Third, the soldiers should not have been forced to make this decision. Lieutenant General McCreary had admitted the mistake, but instead of correcting the mistake, he had forced the soldiers to join new units. This was a failure of command. Fourth, the trial had not been fair. The defense team had not been given sufficient time. Critical witnesses could not be called. The defendants could not mount their own defense. This was a caricature of justice. Please subscribe for this story. And fifth, these men actually believed they were obeying orders. The only commander they trusted was Montgomery. And what had Montgomery told them? You will return to your units. The soldiers believed they were carrying out Montgomery's orders. Beg ended her speech by saying, these men should be given a pardon and their campaign medals should be returned. Parliament listened in silence. Then Armed Forces Minister John Speller took the floor. Speller gave the government's response, and this response was heartbreaking. The minister acknowledged the mistakes that had occurred. Yes, the soldiers had been misdirected. Yes, the organization was chaotic. Yes, a series of officer errors had been made. But then he said, no matter how unjust an order may seem, disobedience to orders in wartime is a serious offense and cannot be forgiven. Speller quoted from General Montgomery's letter dated April 10, 1944. The men refused to go into battle, which of course is unforgivable and cannot be ignored. And then the minister said these words, to pardon these men would be an injustice to the other millions of soldiers who obeyed orders, who complied even when they didn't like it, and who fought. Especially, it would be disrespectful to those who lost their lives because of this. The request for a pardon was rejected. What must Hugh Fraser have felt when he heard this decision? The burden he had carried for 55 years would be carried for 55 more. But Hugh Fraser didn't give up. He told the journalist, I would do the same thing again, because it was a matter of principle. These words, perhaps, are the summary of the entire story. These men were not cowards. They were not fleeing from battle. They simply wanted the promise made to them to be kept, and for this they had risked everything. What do you think about this? What would you have decided? The rejection in 2000 was not the end of the story. In 2006, Anne Beg once again requested a pardon in Parliament. The BBC brought the issue back into the spotlight. Debates flared up in public opinion. But the result didn't change. The government rejected the pardon once again. At this point, we need to ask a question. Were these men really guilty? Legally, yes, they had disobeyed orders in wartime. This was mutiny, according to the Military Penal Code, and mutiny was an offense punishable by death. But morally? Think about it. These men had been lied to. They had been promised they would return to their units, then sent to completely different units. The organization was chaotic. When they arrived at Salerno, no one had met them. They had been abandoned in a field for 3 days. The commanders had admitted the mistake. McCreary had openly said it was a balls-up. But instead of correcting the mistake, he had chosen to force the soldiers. And the trial had not been fair. The defense was inadequate. There were no witnesses. The defendants had been silenced. An American academic wrote, "If these men had been in the Soviet army or the Nazi army, they would have been shot on the beach." But in the West, in liberal democracies, the individual conscience has value, and these men decided that their own sense of justice was more important than military orders. Is this a dangerous thought? Perhaps. If every soldier questions orders according to their own conscience, armies collapse. War cannot be won without discipline. But at the same time, this thought lies at the foundation of Western civilization. At the Nuremberg trials, the defense of following orders was rejected. Individual conscience was held above blind obedience. The Salerno mutineers lived this principle before Nuremberg. So why does this story matter? Because this story is not just the story of 191 soldiers. This is the story of the human face of war. War is told through tales of heroism, great victories, brave commanders, glorious units. But war also has a dark side: bureaucratic errors, unjust trials, forgotten victims. The Salerno mutineers became symbols of this dark side. These men had fought for the British Empire. In the desert heat, against German tanks, they had faced death. At El Alamein, they had changed the course of history. And then, with the stroke of a pen, they were declared mutineers. Their medals were taken away, their pensions were cut, their honor was trampled underfoot. And for 50 years, they couldn't tell their stories. Was this fair? Today, most of the Salerno mutineers are no longer alive. Hugh Fraser passed away in the early 2000s. With him went the last witnesses who could tell the story firsthand. But the story lives on. Saul David's book passed this story on to future generations. BBC documentaries reached millions of people. And every year on the anniversary of the Salerno landings, these men are remembered. Were they pardoned? No. Were their medals returned? No. But perhaps most importantly, they are no longer forgotten. And perhaps that was the real victory. Hugh Fraser said before he died, "I was not a coward. My friends were not cowards. We simply wanted the promise made to us to be kept. And for this, we were prepared to pay the price." These words are perhaps the finest monument. Now I want to ask you a question. What would you have done? If you had been on the shores of Salerno in 1943, if you had been torn away from the friends you had fought alongside for years, if you had learned you had been lied to, and if an officer had said to you, either obey or die, what would you have done? There's no easy answer to this question, and perhaps that's why the Salerno Mutiny is still debated today. Our story ends here, but history never ends. Perhaps one day these men will be pardoned. Perhaps their medals will be returned. Perhaps the justice of the fight they fought will finally be acknowledged. Until that day, it is our duty to remember them. The heroes of El Alamein, the desert rats, and yes, the Salerno mutineers. Their story, their courage, and the price they paid must never be forgotten. Thank you for watching this video. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments what would you have done. And see you in the next video, because history is full of thousands of stories waiting to be told. But first, let me give you a hint. In our next video, we'll discover another hidden story of the Second World War, a story where courage and betrayal, loyalty and revenge are intertwined, a story that remained in darkness for 80 years. Hint: this story takes place on an island, and its heroes are people you wouldn't expect. Are you curious? Then subscribe and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss this story. See you soon. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.